I want to be clear from the start. I did not intend any of this. The Colonial Authority's report calls me a willful harborer of Class IV restricted predatory fauna and suggests I demonstrated deliberate tactical manipulation of pack bonding instincts for personal security gain. Inspector Yelm wrote that part himself, which tells you something about Inspector Yelm, because the truth is I gave a dying animal a biscuit and then didn't know how to make it leave. That is the entire story. Everything else is just the Grakk being the Grakk. My name is Edric Voss. I am 51 years old. I farm grain on a dry colonial fringe world called Caldera Reach, and I have lived alone on this property since my wife Sira passed 4 years ago. The farm is 340 hectares of red dust flatland, a grain elevator that lists slightly east, 2 irrigation rigs that work when they feel like it, a main house that could charitably be described as standing, and a bunkhouse I use for storage because there is nobody left to sleep in it. I have a cat named Boot who is ancient and contemptuous and who contributes nothing to the operation. I grow a variety of drought-resistant grain called Caldera that tastes like cardboard and sells for barely enough to keep the rigs running. I am not a man who keeps predators. I am not a man who has any particular relationship with the local fauna. I am a man who wakes before sunrise, drinks bad coffee, eats the same 2 biscuits I have been eating every morning for 20 years, and then goes to work. Sira used to say I was so consistent I was practically mechanical, and she meant it as a gentle observation rather than a criticism, and I took it that way. The routine is the farm. The farm is the routine. You vary it and you start losing things, and things on a fringe colonial property are not easily replaced. That is the life. It was a quiet life. The Grakk changed that. Or rather, the Grakk changed nothing about the routine and changed everything around it, which is an important distinction. If you have never seen a Grakk, the Colonial Survey's formal description is 6-limbed ridge-skulled apex pack predator, Caldera Reach endemic, Class IV restricted, territorial range of approximately 400 square kilometers per pack, threat assessed, extreme. The survey photograph shows an adult female from a respectful distance, which still puts her at roughly the size of a large draft horse. If a draft horse had 6 legs, a skull ridge like a hatchet blade, and a bioluminescent throat sac that pulses blue-white when it vocalizes. They travel in packs of 5 to 9. They are the reason Caldera Reach has no wild megafauna larger than a feral goat. The Grakk ate everything else over the course of several 100,000 years and appear to have no regrets about it. The survey notes a hierarchical pack structure, coordinated hunting behavior, and an observed capacity for what the researcher called tactical patience, which is the academic way of saying they are willing to wait as long as necessary for the correct outcome. They are also, it turns out, intensely interested in routine. I did not know that last part when I found the cub. I did not know very much about Grakk at all, having spent the past 22 years focused on grain and irrigation, and the particular administrative struggles of fringe colonial farming, where the bureaucratic machinery of the Colonial Authority is always slightly behind the actual conditions on the ground. It was the middle of a dry summer, the kind of summer Caldera Reach specializes in, where the dust hangs in the air so long it starts to feel structural. I was walking my south irrigation ditch at first light, checking for the blockages that accumulate when the dust blows south, and I nearly stepped on it. It was wedged between 2 boulders at the base of the ditch embankment, and it was not moving. I stopped. I looked at it for a while. A Grakk cub at roughly 8 weeks, which is what the veterinary assessment later told me this one was, is approximately the size of a large dog, has all 6 of its legs but not yet the musculature to use them properly, has a skull ridge that is still soft enough to dent slightly if you press it, and has bioluminescent sacs that haven't come in yet, which means its throat is just gray skin. It was gray all over, actually. The dust had gotten into its fur, and the fur was matted flat against its ribs, which I could count from where I was standing. Its eyes were half open and filmed with the particular quality of not quite consciousness that I associated with things that were not going to make it to noon. I should have left it. The survey is very clear. Do not approach Grakk. Do not attempt to assist Grakk. Do not make contact with Grakk. Contact the Colonial Authority Wildlife Office at the number posted in every settlement hall. The pack would almost certainly detect the cub's distress and retrieve it. That was the protocol. The protocol made sense. The Grakk are not animals you help the way you help a limping feral goat. The pack was not here, though, and the cub looked the way things look when they are deciding whether to stop trying. I know that look. I have seen it in Caldera Reach when the irrigation fails at the wrong week, and in old equipment when it has run its last useful cycle, and in people too, though I try not to think about that too long or too often. It is a look I find difficult to walk away from. Sierra would have said that was my best quality and also my most reliable source of complications. She was right about both things. So I didn't walk away. I climbed down into the ditch, which was dry as everything else, and I crouched next to the cub and I looked at it more carefully. Dehydrated, probably exhausted. A cut on its left rear flank, not deep, but it had been there a while and had not been attended to. No obvious broken bones, but it wasn't using its middle pair of legs at all, just tucked them in against its body like they were items it had decided to stop carrying for a while. I did not have water with me. I had my work pack, which had tools, a comm unit, and the 2 biscuits I had brought for my mid-morning break because I sometimes lost track of time in the south fields, and it was useful to have something to eat out there. They were plain grain biscuits. Caldera Reach flour, salt, fat, nothing interesting. Sierra used to make them properly with dried herbs and a glaze, and they were something worth eating. Mine were not. They had the virtue of being filling and the disadvantage of being nothing else. I broke one in half and put it in front of the cub's nose. I don't know why. I am not sure I had a reason that would hold up to much examination. It was simply the thing I had, and the thing I had was food, and the cub looked like it needed food. The logic was not complicated. I have found that the logic of giving something a portion of what you have is rarely complicated, when you are actually in front of the thing that needs it. The cub's nostrils moved. Its eyes came a little more into focus. It lifted its head, which clearly cost something. I could see the effort in the set of its neck, and it sniffed at the biscuit half, and then, with the cautious deliberateness of something that has decided to try one more thing before it stops, it ate it. I gave it the other half, then I gave it the second biscuit. Then I went back to the house, got a bucket of water and a cloth and brought them back. The cub drank most of the water. I used the cloth, damp, to clean the cut on its flank, which it permitted with the resigned tolerance of an animal that has run out of energy to protest things. By the time it had finished the water, it was sitting up on 4 of its 6 legs, and it was looking at me with an expression I could not read at all because I had no prior experience with Grakk expressions. I calmed the Colonial Authority Wildlife Office. I waited 12 minutes on hold. I left a message that was not returned that day or the day after. I went back to the house. The cub followed me. I want to be precise about this. I did not carry it. I did not call it. I did not make any gesture of invitation whatsoever. I turned around and walked back to the house across 300 meters of flat red dust, and when I reached the porch and turned around again, the cub was approximately 4 meters behind me, moving on 5 of its 6 legs with the 6th tucked up, watching me with those filmed-over eyes that were beginning to clear. I stood on the porch for a while. The cub sat in the dust at the base of the porch steps and waited, in the manner of something that has arrived at its destination and is prepared to remain there. Boot the cat came to the door, observed the situation with the professional assessment of a creature that has survived on nothing but independent judgment for 17 years, and went back inside. Boot has always had good threat assessment instincts, or possibly just good sense about which problems are worth engaging with. I have never been entirely sure which. The result is the same. I brought the cub another bucket of water and a bowl of the dried protein feed I use for Boot, which Boot would not miss because Boot eats about 4 bites of anything before becoming bored with the whole enterprise. The cub ate the entire bowl in approximately 90 seconds. I went inside. It curled up on the porch. When I came out the next morning at first light to start the coffee, it was still there. It had slept in the exact spot I had left it and had not, as far as I could tell, moved during the night. It watched me open the door with a quality of attention that reminded me of nothing so much as a farm dog that has decided to be somebody's problem and has made peace with that decision. It watched me start the coffee. When I sat down at the porch table with my 2 biscuits and my cup, it stood up on 5 legs, favoring the tucked 6th, and walked to the table and sat down next to my chair with the precision of something that had been told this was its seat and had been thinking about it all night. I gave it half a biscuit. This was, I understand in retrospect, my error. Not the first biscuit in the ditch, that was just food for a dying animal, and any person would have done the same or close to it. This biscuit was different. This biscuit was the second morning in a row, at the same table at the same time, as part of the same sequence of actions. It was not a gift, it was a portion. You do not offer a Grakk a portion. Or rather, you do not offer it more than once because the first time is feeding and the second time is covenant, and the Grakk do not have a word for the difference the way we do, so they operate on the assumption that you know what you are doing. I did not know what I was doing. I was eating breakfast and it was polite to share. Over the following 10 days, the cub healed. The cut on its flank scabbed over and began to close. The middle legs came back into service, tentatively at first and then with increasing confidence, the cub testing them the way a person tests a floor they are not certain will hold. The bioluminescent sacs came in faint pulses of blue-white along its throat that brightened when it was alert and dimmed when it was at ease. I learned that dim meant calm, which I appreciated enormously because dim was most of the time, particularly at breakfast. Breakfast was important to it. I understood this by the end of the first week with a clarity I had not expected. The cub attended every breakfast with the seriousness of a formal appointment that had been on its calendar for some time and that it intended to honor. It sat in its spot, next to my chair, slightly to the left, close enough that its shoulder contacted my knee if either of us shifted, and it waited with perfect patience while I poured coffee and opened the container and took out the biscuits and broke the first one and ate half and gave the cub the other half. Then it waited while I drank half the coffee. Then I broke the second biscuit and gave the cub 3/4 of it, because it was clearly more interested in the biscuit than I was, and I had started eating breakfast before 5 in the morning specifically to have enough time before the day's work began, not because I was particularly hungry at that hour. The Colonial Authority had not called back. I calmed them again on day 11. I was put on hold for 9 minutes and then informed by an automated routing system that relocation of juvenile Class IV predators required an in-person assessment, and the next available appointment was in 6 weeks. I said I understood and calmed off and went back to walking the irrigation line with the cub 3 paces behind me, which was the position it had settled on as the appropriate following distance for a farm walk. On day 14, the pack arrived. I was in the north field running the irrigation calibration when the sensors on the perimeter fence went active across about 180 meters of the east boundary. 6 large contacts moving in a loose formation, not running, not stalking in the low crouched way the survey described as hunting posture, just walking at the measured pace of something that has somewhere specific to be and is not in a hurry because it is confident of arrival, moving toward the house. I drove the service vehicle back. I was not calm exactly, but I was not panicking either, because I had spent the past 2 weeks with a Grakk cub sleeping on my porch, and the experience had recalibrated my baseline for what constituted a crisis. The cub was in the house. I had begun letting it inside on day 9 when it became clear it was going to work the latch on the screen door regardless of whether I invited it, and whatever the pack wanted, they were going to track the cub to wherever the cub was. The cub was with me. I was the relevant variable. I drove back and I decided as I drove that I was going to meet the situation by standing in the yard and letting it unfold, because there was no other reasonable option. I got back to the house. The pack was in the yard. 6 adult Grakk in a yard is an experience I recommend only to people with good cardiovascular health and a high tolerance for the sudden understanding that you are not the apex predator in your own property. The smallest of them was still larger than my service vehicle. They were in a rough arc formation facing the house, and they were not making audible noise, which turned out to be more unsettling than if they had been, because Grakk silence has a physical weight to it. You feel the mass of it the way you feel the pressure of weather changing. The throat sacs pulsed in slow, alternating patterns, blue-white and then settling, blue-white and then settling. I later learned this was the pack's resting alert state, watchful, assessing, not hostile. The cub pushed through the screen door. He had figured out the latch in both directions by this point, and walked across the porch and down the steps and into the middle of the arc and sat down. There was a period of consultation. The pack leaned in around the cub, and there was a low, subsonic vibration I felt in my sternum more than heard with my ears, and the cub's throat sac pulsed in a complicated sequence I had not seen it produce before, and then the pack straightened. They looked at me, all 6 of them, in unison, with the coordinated attention of a committee that has just reached a decision and is now looking at the subject of that decision. I stood on the porch and looked back. The largest adult female, I would later determine the pack alpha, who I eventually named Hall because of her habit of picking things up with her front limbs and moving them to locations she found more structurally appropriate, a habit that accounted for the repositioning of my south gate post, 2 irrigation junction covers, and a section of the bunkhouse porch railing. Hall walked toward the porch. Not running, not stalking. Walking with the unhurried authority of something that has decided to approach and is not particularly invested in your feelings about this decision. She stopped at the base of the porch steps. We were approximately 3 meters apart. Her skull ridge, standing flat, put her eye level at my sternum, but she had her head slightly lowered, which brought her amber vertical pupil eyes level with my face. Her throat sac pulsed once, slow, and settled dim. I said, "Hello." I am aware this was not an impressive thing to say. It was what I had. Hall held my gaze for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to the pack. She made a sound in the subsonic register. I felt it, a single organized pulse, different from the examination pattern, and the pack spread out. 2 went to the east fence line, moving with the decisive purpose of animals taking a post rather than exploring. 2 went south toward the grain storage. 1 circled the house once in a wide, steady loop, and then settled on the ground near the north side wall. Hall came back and sat at the base of the porch steps, and did not move again for the rest of the day. That was how I acquired 6 additional Grakk. 7, counting the cub, whom I had by this point named Bracket, on account of the way he sat, front 4 legs together, rear 2 slightly splayed, body settled between them with the comfortable solidity of furniture that has decided where it belongs. He slept on the porch. Hall began sleeping at the foot of the porch steps each night, close enough that I could hear the subsonic hum of her resting breath through the floorboards. The other 5 distributed themselves around the property, in positions I would eventually understand, after the xenobiology team arrived and explained things, as a coordinated perimeter with overlapping sight lines. My Caldera began to recover that season, which I attributed initially to the rainfall being marginally better, but the farm's external camera logs later showed me what was actually happening. The local grain pest population, the burrowing threnids that had damaged my east field for 3 consecutive seasons, vanished within 8 days of the Grakk's arrival. The Grakk hunted them at night with an efficiency that left no sign except absence. By week 3, the east field was clean for the first time in years, and by week 5, I could see the crop recovering in rows that had been stunted the previous 2 seasons. I noted this in my farm log with the careful neutrality of a man trying not to form any conclusions that might complicate the administrative situation he was already in. The Colonial Authority still had not been back in touch. I considered calming them a third time, but the cub was healed, the farm was running better than it had in years, and every large Grakk on my property was behaving with what I could only describe as professional decorum. They did not damage anything except what Hall moved on structural grounds. They did not approach me uninvited, only Hall, at the established distance, only when I was outside and stationary. They did not interact with Boot at all, which Boot regarded as the only appropriate arrangement, and which I suspect Boot had negotiated somehow, though I have no evidence for this. Then the breakfast formalization developed, and that is where things became genuinely strange. It was gradual. The first sign was Hall appearing at the porch table area at the approximate time of my morning breakfast on the 4th day after the pack's arrival. She did not come onto the porch. She sat at the base of the steps in her established place and watched. I broke my biscuit and gave Brackett his half. I drank my coffee. Hall watched all of this with the focused attention of someone reading a document they intend to memorize. By the end of the 2nd week, all 7 Grakk attended breakfast. Not on the porch. The porch is a practical structure and not designed for that weight distribution, and the Grakk seemed to understand this instinctively, but arranged in the yard in front of it. Hall at the steps, the others in a loose semicircle behind her, all facing the porch table. They arrived before I sat down. They waited while I made the coffee, which I could see them doing through the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn with an unmoving patience that I found either admirable or unnerving depending on what hour I had woken up. They waited while I opened the container. They waited while I broke the biscuits. I gave Brackett his half. I ate my half. I drank the coffee. The Grakk watched all of this without moving. When I finished and stood up, they dispersed to their positions. That was breakfast. I did not think much of it. Animals observe routine. They key on feeding times and associate them with the presence of the provider. This was not so different, I told myself, from Boot appearing on the kitchen counter at approximately the same time each evening with an expression of cold accusation if the food bowl was not full. The scale was different. The basic dynamic was the same. Then Brackett started dividing his half biscuit. He received it, and I want to be precise, because I was very consistent. The same half, broken at the same point on the biscuit, presented with my left hand because my right hand was usually holding the coffee. He received the half, ate a quarter of it himself, and then carried the other quarter carefully in his teeth across the porch steps to Hall and placed it on the ground in front of her. Hall ate it. Then the next morning, Brackett divided the quarter again. A small piece to the Grakk at the east fence post, a small piece to the one near the north wall. By the end of the week, he had a route. He did it with the unhurried precision of a clerk who has worked out the most efficient sequence for a set of deliveries and sees no reason to deviate from it. He was unfailingly consistent. The amounts were small, impractical as food, not enough to matter nutritionally. But he did it every morning, to every member of the pack, in the same order. I watched this happen with the steady interest of a man who does not fully understand what he is watching, but suspects it is more significant than it appears. Hall watched me watch. Her throat sac pulsed in the complicated pattern I had seen on the day the pack arrived, not the resting alert pattern, something more organized, with a structure that repeated in a way that seemed intentional. She held my gaze. I broke my second biscuit and gave Brackett a larger portion than usual because it seemed like he needed the operational budget. Hall's throat sac went dim in the slow, even way I had started to identify as the Grakk equivalent of acknowledging receipt of something. I later learned, when the xenobiology team arrived from Caldera Station, and one of them could not contain her professional excitement long enough to organize complete sentences. I had to offer her a glass of water and wait while she collected herself, which she acknowledged with an apology, and then immediately became excited again. I later learned that what Brackett had been doing was the formal distribution of a pack's ceremonial ration. The act of receiving food from a pack member, and then distributing a precise portion to every other member of the pack in rank order, was a behavior the Grakk used to signal what the translator kept cycling through terminology for. Provision covenant, sustenance authority bond, before settling on the term that ended up in the documentation, Hearth right. The distribution was not about the food. It was never about the food. It was about the acknowledgement, the formal recognition that the provision had come from the authority and was being shared downward through the structure. Brackett had logged me, on that second morning on the porch, as having established Hearth right over the pack, and he had been formally confirming that status at every breakfast since. The xenobiologist Dr. Marin, whose official assessment I still have, though I keep it in a drawer because looking at it requires accepting a certain amount of responsibility. Dr. Marin told me that this was documented Grakk behavior, observed in the wild, but never before recorded in a settled world context, and never before with a non-Grakk individual in the provision authority role. She said the Grakk classification system for other species was binary, prey or pack. She said the pack had, apparently, found a third category. She said she wanted to spend 3 months on the farm collecting observational data. I said that was fine, provided she stayed out of the way during the irrigation calibration runs. She stayed 6 months. She and Brackett developed what I can only describe as a collegial working relationship, which I found remarkable given that Brackett outweighed her by approximately 260 kilograms. But that is getting ahead of things. By month 2, the Hearth dominance display was formalized in the way the pack handled it, which is to say, it developed specificity I had not anticipated. Hall moved from the base of the steps to the edge of the porch itself, not on it, but aligned with the porch deck, her front limbs at the threshold, and the other 5 adults arranged behind her in a specific order that was the same every morning. East Post Grakk, whom I had named 40 after the sector marker near her usual position, immediately behind Hall. Reel and Brace, named for their tendency to operate as a coordinated pair on the perimeter, one always in sight of the other, flanking the formation. The remaining 2, a male I called Silt and the youngest adult female I called Quill, anchoring the rear in positions that Dr. Marin later told me corresponded to the pack's rearguard designations in hunting formation. They also changed the close of the ceremony, and this change was what Dr. Marin flagged as the most significant behavioral data point of her study. Previously, the pack had dispersed when I stood up from the table. Standing was the signal, movement was release. Now when I stood, Hall made the subsonic sound, the organized pulse, the one I felt as a physical pressure in the lower chest, and the pack held formation. They held it while I carried my cup inside, while I set it on the counter, while I came back out and picked up the biscuit container. They held it until I had completed the sequence and gone inside for the final time. Then, and only then, on some signal between them I could not detect, they dispersed. Dr. Marin, when I described this to her, put both her hands flat on the porch railing and stood like that for a while. I waited. She said, "They are waiting for dismissal," she said. "The provision authority concludes the rite, and the pack holds formation until conclusion is signaled by the authority leaving the ceremonial space." She said, in a tone I would describe as controlled disbelief, "Mr. Voss, they are standing honor guard at your breakfast table." I said it seemed like a lot of ceremony for 2 biscuits. She said, "The biscuits are incidental. They have codified your morning routine as a formal provision rite. The routine is the ceremony. You are—" She stopped. She looked at her notes. She said, "The term their vocalizations map to through the translator is Hearth dominance display. That is what they are calling it among themselves." I said that was an interesting name for breakfast. She said she needed a moment. I offered her a biscuit. She laughed, which I had not expected, and took it. I want to say something about the months between the formalization and the inspection, because the Colonial Authority report gives the impression of a property under some kind of constant predator-generated tension, an armed encampment. That was not the character of those months at all. The farm was quieter than it had been in years. That is the honest description. The Grakk on perimeter moved without sound. You would not know they were there unless you knew where to look, and even then you were sometimes surprised. The grain grew without the steady background sound of pest damage in the east fields that I had gotten used to as a kind of ambient fact of farm life. Brackett slept on the porch and hummed in the subsonic register when he was deeply asleep, a slow, regular pulse that I found, somewhat to my own surprise, companionable. I had been alone on the property for 4 years. The silence of that had its own quality. The Grakk gave the place a different kind of quiet, not empty, but occupied, watched over, attended. Boot, over the course of about 6 weeks, migrated from the kitchen windowsill that faced the interior to the kitchen windowsill that faced the yard. Whether she was surveilling Hall or had decided that the view of an apex predator was more interesting than the view of the kitchen wall, I was never entirely certain. The Grakk ignored her with a completeness that Boot seemed to regard as appropriate. My nearest neighbors, the Pellanth family, came over in the second month to ask what was happening, which I appreciated because they came on foot, in daylight, announced their approach at the fence gate, and brought a casserole. Davin Pellanth is a practical man whose family has farmed Caldera on this reach for 2 generations, and who responds to unusual situations by gathering information before forming opinions. His daughter Marit, who was with him, was 17, and had the expression of someone who is determined not to show how much she wants to look at the Grakk in the yard. I told them both to make slow movements and not raise their hands above their waists, and then I introduced them to the situation as simply as I could. Davin asked if the pack was going to be a problem for neighboring properties. I said I did not believe so. They had been here 2 months and had not ranged beyond my boundary sensors, which I had confirmed by checking the logs. He nodded. He told me the threnid damage on his east field had also stopped, that in fact, the pest population across the district seemed to have contracted significantly, and that 3 other farms he was aware of had seen the same thing. We agreed this was a net positive and ate the casserole. Marit, on the way out, asked Brackett's name. I told her. She nodded with the grave respect of a person cataloging important information, and they left. I found out 3 months later from Davin that she had calmed the xenobiology department at Caldera Station to report the pack sighting, and had included 3 pages of careful behavioral observations that she had written down from a distance using a surveying scope. Dr. Marin told me this when she arrived. She said Marit's notes had been the most precise field report she had received from a non-professional in years, and that she had written back to her. I thought Sira would have liked Marit. Dr. Marin herself arrived in the 4th month, which is to say approximately 2 months before the authority inspection, with a field kit, a recording array, and a research assistant named Paul who was very young and who stood at the fence gate for a full 30 seconds before he could make his feet move. I let them in, introduced them to Brackett and at a distance to Hall, and explained the situation in the same terms I had explained it to the Pellanths. Dr. Marin listened to all of it and then asked if she could see the biscuit container. I showed it to her. She opened it and smelled it and closed it and set it down and said, "Caldera flour, salt, rendered fat, and a trace of curing compound from the tin." I said that sounded right. She said, "No particular scent profile that would trigger pre-recognition in a Grakk." I said no. She said, "No particular nutrient profile." I said no. I had been eating them for 20 years for the consistency, not the nutritional content. She looked at me for a moment and said, "They have codified a ritual around an object with no functional significance to them because the object is what the authority uses." I said I supposed so. She said she needed to sit down. She sat at the porch table, which Brackett approved of, and she asked me to walk her through the full sequence of the morning routine from the moment I woke. So I did. She asked questions. How far into the routine did the pack begin to assemble? At what point did Brackett take his position? Did the pace of the routine affect the pack's behavior? If I ate the biscuit faster, if I drank the coffee slower? I said I had not varied it in 20 years and was not sure what would happen if I did. And she looked at me with the expression of a scientist who has just identified a variable she cannot ethically manipulate and is mourning the lost data. She stayed for 6 months, not 3. The research assistant, Paul, who overcame his initial reluctance with the thoroughness that comes from professional obligation, eventually became comfortable enough with the pack to take sensor readings within 15 meters of 40's east post, which 40 permitted with an indifference that Paul seemed to find either encouraging or insulting. I was never certain which. Dr. Marin and Brackett did develop something over those 6 months that I can only describe as mutual professional tolerance. She observed him, he tolerated being observed, and occasionally when she was working at the porch table, he would position himself at her elbow rather than mine, which she noted in her field log with 3 exclamation points, and then crossed out 2 of them for professionalism. The claim jumper was a man named Osler who had been attempting for 3 years to acquire a portion of my south field through a series of boundary survey disputes that had not gone anywhere legally, but which he had continued pursuing with the persistence of a man who believes the right sequence of administrative pressure will eventually produce a different answer from the same property. I had always been civil with him, because there is no advantage in having bad relationships with neighbors on a fringe world even when those neighbors are wrong, and also because the process had legal channels and I had chosen to engage with those channels rather than with him directly. He drove up one afternoon in the 3rd month. His vehicle came down the approach road and stopped at the yard entrance, and he got out. He saw Hall in the yard. He stood next to his vehicle door for a moment, not moving. Hall looked at him. I came out of the house. I said, Osler. He said, Was. He looked at Hall. He said, You have a... He did not finish the sentence. He gestured vaguely at Hall with a hand that stopped partway through the gesture, when he appeared to realize that making large movements in the yard was perhaps not the approach he wanted to be taking. I said the pack had been on the property for about 3 months, and they wouldn't bother him if he wasn't trouble. This was my honest assessment based on 3 months of observation, and the fact that the Pellants had visited twice without incident, and it turned out to be accurate. He said he wanted to discuss the South Survey boundary again. He began walking toward the house, crossing the yard, and as he walked he was talking, the way a person talks when they are both addressing you and managing their own anxiety about something. And as he passed Hall, he made a broad arm gesture, the kind of emphasis that comes naturally when someone is making a point and isn't thinking about the spatial context. His hand came within approximately 1 meter of Hall's skull ridge. Hall did not bite him. I want to be absolutely clear about this. No Grakk on the property touched Osler or approached him. What happened? Hall turned her head and tracked the hand, and her throat sac fired white, not the slow ceremonial pulse, the fast alert pulse, full brightness white, the one I associated with the moment before something she considered a threat became a situation she was going to resolve. She made the subsonic sound, not the organized single pulse, the other one shorter, sharper. All 6 other Grakk were on their feet, in the time it takes a person to draw a breath. They did not advance on him. They rose and moved to positions in the yard, not toward him, but distributed around him, at the same distances Osler had passed through without noticing on his way across the yard, each one at a point that together described a perimeter with him at the center. None of them made a sound. None of them were crouched in hunting posture. They were simply standing, 700 kilograms of apex predator times 6, in a formation that the containment behavior literature Dr. Marin left me later described as a posture of total environmental authority. Osler stopped. He had stopped in the middle of a sentence and he did not finish it. He was standing very still. Hall let the fast pulse run for approximately 5 seconds. Then, slowly, she let it dim to the resting alert pattern and then to dim. I said, "Probably don't make big gestures near the yard animals." Osler said, in a voice operating under significant management, that perhaps the boundary question could wait for another time. I said that sounded reasonable. He returned to his vehicle with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who has become very aware of the distance between himself and it. He got in. He drove away at a pace that was neither slow nor fast, which I found a reasonable choice. The boundary survey dispute was formally withdrawn by his legal contact 43 days later. I have not seen Osler since. I have no strong feelings about this either way. The Colonial Authority inspection was scheduled for the 3rd of Caldera's autumn. Inspector Yelm arrived in a vehicle bearing the Colonial Authority emblem, with Deputy Kars carrying the second half of the assessment kit. The morning had the thin, red dust haze that comes in with the autumn cooling, and the light had that quality of early autumn on a dry world where everything looks slightly more considered than it did in summer. Inspector Yelm was precise. He had a tablet with the case file, a survey kit, a uniform with the crispness of something that has not been outside much. He had an 11-page behavioral profile on Grakk pack dynamics and a departmental mandate to assess, document, and recommend. Kars was younger, carrying more of the equipment, and had the look of someone who had been briefed on the situation using numbers, but was now confronting the reality that numbers and the thing in front of you are different kinds of information. There were 7 Grakk in the yard. It was mid-morning, breakfast was 2 hours past, and the pack had dispersed to positions. But dispersed, for a 7-strong Grakk pack, still means a Grakk at the east fence, Grakk in the south quarter, Grakk at the grain elevator, Grakk near the bunkhouse, Hall in the yard proper, and Brackett on the porch. Brackett looked at the authority vehicle and then at me and then back at the vehicle with the expression of a young animal assessing whether a new thing is a development it needs to have an opinion about. Inspector Yelm looked at his tablet. He looked at the yard. He said, in a tone of professional control that was costing him something, that he was Inspector Yelm, Wildlife and Fauna Division, here to conduct the assessment of my Class IV harboring situation, and he was authorized to enter the property and conduct a full evaluation of the pack's status and the appropriate remediation. I said I understood, and I invited him and Kars onto the porch. Here is where the situation developed its particular shape. It was half past the mid-morning mark, which meant I had missed my usual work break. I had been inside reviewing sensor logs when the authority vehicle came down the approach road and had not eaten since breakfast. On the farm, missing the work break means doing the break when you can, and when Yelm and Kars came onto the porch, I simply sat down at the table and opened the biscuit container, because I was hungry and that is what I do. I did not think about what would happen next. I was not attempting to arrange anything. I was hungry. This is what I eat. I had not eaten since the morning and it was 2 hours past when I should have. Brackett rose from his porch position and walked to the table and sat beside my chair. Hall from the yard made the subsonic sound. 6 Grakk moved to the porch. They arranged themselves in the yard in front of it with the smooth, coordinated precision of a unit that has performed this maneuver many times and sees no reason to rush. Hall at the porch threshold. 40 behind her, Reel and Brace flanking, Silt and Quill at the rear. The formal Hearth dominance display as it had developed over the past 6 months executed in full. 700 kilograms per animal, 6 animals, absolute stillness, throat sacs in the slow ceremonial pulse. Blue-white, settling, blue-white, settling. Inspector Yelm was standing at the top of the porch steps with his tablet. Deputy Kars was directly behind him with the equipment kit. Neither of them was moving. I broke the first biscuit. I gave Brackett half. I ate my half. I drank the coffee I had poured before Yeln arrived, which was now cold, but cold coffee is what happens on working mornings, and I have made my peace with it. I looked up at Inspector Yeln. I said, "Did you want a biscuit?" He said, carefully, that he was here on behalf of the Colonial Wildlife and Fauna Division to conduct a formal assessment. I said he was welcome to sit down. I gestured at the other porch chair. Yeln sat down. He sat with the precise movements of a man operating primarily on professional discipline, which I respected. He opened his tablet. He looked at it. He looked at the formation in the yard. He looked at Brackett, who was waiting with the patient readiness of an animal at the beginning of a ceremony it knows well. I broke my second biscuit. I gave Brackett 3/4 of it. Brackett stood, took his quarter, and began the distribution walk. He went a hall first and placed a portion in front of her with the careful precision of an official delivering a document. Then down the formation, each member in order, a small portion placed with both front limbs. Inspector Yeln watched all of this. He said very quietly, "What is he doing?" I said he was distributing the ration. I said he did it every morning. I said apparently he also did it at mid-morning breaks, though this was the first time I had seen it at that hour. I said I suspected it was because the break was happening at a formal venue with observers present, and Brackett had apparently decided the display applied. Yeln looked at his tablet. He looked at the yard. He said, "How long has this been happening?" I said approximately 6 months, starting from the day the pack arrived. He said, "And you've been the biscuit every morning?" I said 1 biscuit, split, with the cub distributing a portion. I said I had been eating the same breakfast for 20 years. He looked at his tablet for a long time. Then he set it down. He said, "Mr. Voss, I need to be honest with you about something." I said that would be welcome. He said, "My department has a standard protocol for unauthorized Class IV harboring. The protocol is assessment, documentation, and recommendation of relocation." He paused. He said, "My department also has a provision I have not previously needed to invoke, under emergency wildlife bonding status, which recognizes cases where the risk of disruption exceeds the risk of continuation." Another pause. He said, "I am going to need to invoke that provision." I said I figured there was something like that. He said, "A full pack that has established Hearth bond with a provision authority cannot be separated from that authority without—" He looked at his tablet. He read something. He set the tablet down carefully. He said, "The behavioral literature describes forced separation from a Hearth right holder as generating a retrieval response that scales with the strength of the established bond." He said, "Based on what I am looking at right now, and based on the 6-month duration and the full display formalization," he said, "the retrieval response would consume the better part of this district's enforcement assets for several weeks minimum." I said they would come back for me. He said, "Mr. Voss, you are their Hearth authority. They would not stop." He also told me then, what Dr. Marin had not yet said, that the xenobiology team had been tracking this pack for 11 years. That their ranging territory had historically extended 412 square kilometers. That over the past 6 months, that range had contracted. Not expanded, contracted. The pack had voluntarily given up 372 square kilometers of historical territory. They had voluntarily reduced their range to match mine. I sat with that. 340 hectares. The south ditch and the north field and the grain elevator listing east and the bunkhouse nobody slept in. I said, because of the biscuit. He said, because of the Hearth right. Because of the display. Because you are their provision authority and the Hearth is wherever the authority is and their Hearth is here. He said it the way a person reads a regulation that has not previously felt relevant to his daily work and finds that it is suddenly very relevant. He filed the non-standard assessment. He and Carr stayed for 2 more hours, and he asked questions that were careful and precise and non-adversarial, which I appreciated. He asked about the perimeter behavior, the nightly hunting patterns, the interaction with the neighboring properties. He asked whether I had ever felt at risk on the property, to which I said no, and he noted this in his tablet with the look of a man who was not entirely surprised by the answer but needed it on record. He asked about Boot. I said Boot had adapted. He looked at me. I said Boot was a cat of considerable practical intelligence. He noted this in his tablet as well, under a heading I did not ask about. Kars, at the end of his portion of the assessment, asked me what the pack ate besides the biscuit portions, because the nutritional quantity was clearly not the point, but he wanted to understand the daily structure. I walked him through the hunting patterns and the threaded work and what I could reconstruct from the camera logs about the nightly ranging, the routes they took, the areas they prioritized, the way they returned to position by first light without fail. He took very careful notes. On his way out, in a tone that was not going into the official report, he told me he had grown up on a grain farm 3 districts over and that he understood what an intact perimeter meant to a yield. I said I imagined he did. He said he imagined I knew that too. Quill had 3 cubs last spring. The pack is now 10. Brackett is no longer the youngest member, which he seems to regard as a personal advancement of some significance. He has taken the new cubs in hand with a seriousness that suggests he understands his role clearly and intends to execute it well. The 3 cubs attended their first full Hearth dominance display 4 weeks ago, standing in a very small subformation behind Quill, with the expressions of animals who are performing a ceremony for the first time and are determined to get it right. Brackett distributed their portions with great deliberateness. I gave him extra biscuit budget for the occasion. Hall's throat sac pulsed slow and even in the morning light. The formation held until I carried the plate inside. Dr. Marin comes out twice a year now, for a week at a time, with a small research team. They are quiet, methodical, and unfailingly polite to the Grakk, which the Grakk acknowledge with the specific indifference they reserve for things that are not the provision authority and are not threats, the same way they regard Boot. Merritt Pellenth, who is 19 now, has started accompanying Dr. Marin's team as a field assistant. She has an eye for behavioral detail that makes her genuinely useful, and she brings a covered dish from her father when she comes, which I appreciate because it is better food than I make. The farm has a different rhythm now than it did in Sierra's time, and different again from the 4 years I ran it alone after she was gone. It is not what I would have planned if I had been planning, but plans on a fringe colonial property have a way of meeting the actual conditions and becoming something else. The thrennids are gone, the yield is up, the boundary dispute is resolved, the quarterly reviews are unremarkable. 3 Grakk cubs are learning what breakfast means. These are not bad conditions for a farm. Boot sleeps on the yard-facing windowsill. 40 patrols the east line before first light. Silt and Quill move through the south quarter before the haze burns off. Reel and Brace hold the perimeter angles they have held since the 2nd week. Hall is at the porch threshold before I sit down. She has been at that threshold every morning for 14 months. I have not once beaten her to it. The farm is quiet. The grain grew well this year, the best yield in 6 years, which the district bureau attributed to the rainfall being better, and which I attributed to the rainfall being better, and also to 340 hectares of uninterrupted perimeter patrol by animals that have decided this is their hearth, and are not inclined to negotiate that determination. I did not put the second reason in the yield report. Some things the bureau does not need to know the details of. I have begun making the biscuits the way Sierra used to, with dried herbs and a glaze that takes an additional 12 minutes in the morning, but produces something worth eating. I do not give Brackett the glazed half. He gets the plain half, same as always, because the ceremony does not need improving, and I am not going to be the one to introduce a variable into a 6-month-old formal ritual that 7 apex predators have codified as military doctrine. The glazed half is for me. I eat it at the same table, at the same time, in the same chair. Some things you vary and some things you don't. I have lived long enough to mostly know which is which. I eat the same breakfast every morning. 2 biscuits, a cup of coffee, the early light coming red-orange over the Caldera dust. Bracket beside my chair. Hall at the porch edge. 6 Grakk in formation in the yard and 3 small Grakk cubs behind Quill learning what the formation means. I don't know what the biscuits taste like to them. I imagine not much. They are plain, unseasoned, not interesting. But they attend every morning with the punctuality and gravity that I have only seen applied to things that genuinely matter, and I have stopped trying to explain to myself exactly why that is or what it means in their accounting. I understand it well enough to know that it is real, and that real is enough. What I know is this: a cold morning, a dry ditch, a cub deciding to try one more thing. Half a biscuit placed on the ground in front of a gray-furred nose, a slow, cautious eating, and then the lifting of a head that had been preparing to stay down. The Grakk call it the Hearth dominance display. I call it breakfast. I am apparently the same thing.